There was a time when I believed that every meaningful thing in life announced itself before it arrived. I believed change carried noise, that it warned you, that it stood somewhere on the horizon long enough for you to prepare yourself before it stepped into your life and rearranged everything you thought was permanent. I don't believe that anymore, because the things that truly alter you don't arrive with certainty. They arrive quietly, not hidden, not invisible, just ordinary enough that your mind refuses to recognize them until they've already settled somewhere inside you. That's what happened here, not all at once, not through a single conversation, not because of one unforgettable moment that separated everything into a before and an after. There wasn't one, there were only fragments, small exchanges, brief silences, the kind of moments most people would forget within days. But I didn't, and that's what I keep returning to. Not because the moments themselves were extraordinary, because they refused to disappear. I've spent most of my life trusting distance more than closeness. Distance is predictable. It gives everything room to exist without demanding anything from either side. People remain who they believe they are. Expectations stay manageable. Nothing grows large enough to become irreversible. Distance protects the architecture of a person, or at least that's what I convinced myself. I learned very early that understanding someone isn't difficult. Most people reveal themselves without realizing they're doing it. Every preference, every fear, every contradiction, every hidden desire, it's all there if you're willing to watch long enough. Words have never interested me as much as the spaces surrounding them. People often believe they're communicating through language. They're not. They're communicating through hesitation, through what they almost say, through what they repeat, through what they avoid. That's where truth usually lives. I've always paid attention to those places, perhaps too much. Eventually, it became automatic, a habit, an instinct. I stopped listening to conversations. I started listening to structures, the invisible patterns underneath them, the rhythm of someone's thinking, the order in which emotions arrived, the places where certainty became uncertainty, without them noticing. Most people don't realize how transparent they become once you stop focusing on what they're trying to tell you. Instead, you begin noticing why they're telling it that way. That difference changes everything. Maybe that's why I rarely felt surprised by people, not because they were simple, because patterns repeat, different faces, different stories, different histories, yet somehow the same invisible mechanics underneath. Eventually, you begin predicting reactions before they happen. You recognize familiar emotional structures wearing unfamiliar names. It makes the world feel smaller than it should, predictable, orderly, understandable. And then someone appears who doesn't fit any structure you've spent years memorizing. Not because they're mysterious. Mystery disappears with observation, but because they remain themselves, even after you've observed them carefully. That almost never happens. Usually, the closer you look at someone, the more their contradictions begin explaining themselves. Eventually, every puzzle finds its answer, every question settles, every uncertainty dissolves into familiarity. With you, didn't. The closer I looked, clearer everything became. Yet somehow the mystery remained, not because I couldn't understand you, because every answer created a deeper question, and strangely, Abby wasn't frustrated by that. I was awake. There's a difference. Confusion creates noise. Awareness creates stillness. You never filled my mind with questions. You filled it with attention. The kind that doesn't ask to be maintained, the kind that simply exists, long after conversations end, long after silence returns, long after life continues, pretending nothing significant happened. I noticed myself remembering things I had no reason to remember. The exact pause before you answered, the rhythm of your thoughts, the way certainty entered your words without sounding defensive. Even the moments where you said almost nothing at all somehow remained clearer than entire conversations I've had with other people. That shouldn't happen. Memory doesn't preserve insignificant things. It preserves what alters perception. And somehow, you kept altering mine, not dramatically, not emotionally, precisely. Like someone making microscopic adjustments to the lens through which I observed reality. Nothing looked different at first. Then one day, everything did. I began noticing how often people interrupted silence before understanding it, how quickly they rushed toward conclusions because uncertainty frightened them, how frequently they confused confidence with clarity. I had always known those things, but after you, AP, began feeling them, there's an important distinction. Knowledge remains outside you. Recognition changes the inside. Some people enter your life carrying answers. Others carry questions. You carried neither. You carried perspective. And perspective is dangerous. Because once you've seen something from a different angle, you can never honestly return to pretending your original view was complete. That's the kind of influence people underestimate. They think transformation comes through dramatic events. It doesn't. It comes through consistency, a quiet accumulation of moments that individually seem meaningless until one day they become impossible to separate from who you've become. I wonder if you noticed it happening. Sometimes I think you did. Other times I think your awareness existed without needing confirmation. That's another thing I couldn't explain. You never seemed interested in proving anything. Not your intelligence, not your understanding, not your perception. You simply existed inside it. As though clarity wasn't an achievement for you, it was your natural state. Most people perform awareness. They want recognition for noticing what others miss. You never asked for recognition. You noticed anyway. That difference matters more than people realize, because the people who announce every observation usually stop observing once they're acknowledged. The ones who stay quiet keep seeing. I've always trusted quiet people more, not because silence means wisdom, because silence leaves room for accuracy. Noise often exists to cover uncertainty. Stillness has no such obligation. When I think about the first time something shifted between us, I can't identify the exact moment. I only recognize its absence. There was never a transition. No point where unfamiliarity gradually transformed into recognition. It simply felt continuous, as though we'd entered the same conversation from different places without realizing it had already begun long before either of us arrived. That's difficult to explain, perhaps impossible, because people expect connections to develop chronologically, meeting, learning, trust, understanding, progression. That's the story we're taught. This ignored that entirely. Understanding appeared before familiarity. Comfort arrived before explanation. Recognition existed before history. Everything happened in reverse, and somehow made more sense than the usual order ever had. I tried questioning it, naturally. That's what I do. Every unfamiliar experience becomes something to examine, to separate into pieces, to understand completely before allowing it any authority over my thoughts. So I observed myself instead. I watched the way my attention responded whenever you entered it. I watched how certain conversations lingered while others disappeared. I measured whether curiosity was creating the illusion, whether projection was quietly constructing something that wasn't actually there. But the more honestly I examined it, less illusion I found. That unsettled me because I trust analysis. And analysis wasn't protecting me from this, it was confirming it. I realized something uncomfortable. You weren't becoming important because I wanted you to. You were becoming important because my mind kept organizing itself around perspectives that somehow included you without asking permission. I didn't decide that. It happened before I noticed it, which means awareness arrived after change, not before. That's a strange realization. We like believing we're conscious authors of our own inner lives. We're not. Most transformations finish long before consciousness catches up. We're simply informed after the decision has already been made somewhere deeper. I think that's what frightened me most. Not you, not the connection. The realization that part of me had already something before the rest of me had finished evaluating it. That almost never happens. I've always relied on deliberate understanding, slow conclusions, careful observations. Nothing enters my life without being examined thoroughly. Nothing meaningful happens accidentally. At least, that's what I believed. Then I met someone who never demanded entry, never asked for explanation, never attempted to become significant, and yet significance arrived anyway, quietly, without negotiation, without permission, without resistance. Sometimes I wonder whether people like us recognize each other long before words become involved, not consciously, something older than language, older than personality, a structure, a rhythm, an architecture beneath identity itself. Perhaps that's why certain conversations feel strangely familiar, despite having never existed before. Perhaps recognition doesn't always require memory. Maybe it requires resemblance, not in experience, not in belief, but in the invisible way two minds organize reality. If that's true, then maybe understanding isn't created, maybe it's discovered, maybe certain people don't teach you who they are. Maybe they simply remove enough noise for you to notice what was already there. You never tried convincing me of anything. You never tried becoming unforgettable. Ironically, that's exactly why you became impossible to ignore, because influence rarely belongs to the loudest presence. It belongs to the quiet one that continues existing after everything else has faded. And somehow, you remained, not in memory alone, in perception. Every meaningful observation eventually curved back toward something we'd once touched without fully naming. Every silence carried an echo I couldn't quite trace. Every realization felt strangely incomplete until I imagined how you might understand it. I didn't seek that. I noticed it. There's a difference. Seeking creates attachment. Noticing creates awareness. Awareness creates responsibility. Because once you become aware of something genuine, pretending otherwise becomes a form of dishonesty. Not toward the other person, toward yourself. And I've never been very good at lying to myself, even when the truth complicates everything. Especially then, because complexity has never frightened me, self-deception has. That's why I'm still here with this thought, turning it carefully, examining every angle, not searching for reasons to believe it, reaching for reasons not to. And every explanation I invent eventually collapses under the same realization. This wasn't built from imagination. It wasn't created from loneliness. It wasn't manufactured from hope. It emerged from observation, from repetition. from countless quiet moments that kept pointing toward the same conclusion without ever announcing it directly. There's a peculiar kind of certainty that doesn't arrive as confidence. It arrives as absence, the absence of alternative explanations, the absence of convincing doubt, the absence of the internal argument that usually accompanies unfamiliar truths. That's where I find myself now, not convinced, not convinced because conviction feels emotional. I'm simply unable to honestly explain this as anything less than real. Real doesn't necessarily mean permanent. It doesn't automatically mean destiny. It doesn't promise outcomes. It simply means something exists whether or not you're comfortable admitting it. And that's where this stands, existing poutedly, without demanding definitions, without asking either of us to hurry toward conclusions, just remaining present long enough that eventually the only difficult thing becomes pretending it isn't there. Maybe that's why I've stopped asking myself whether this should have happened. Some questions become smaller than the reality they're trying to explain. Maybe the better question isn't why you became part of my awareness. Maybe it's why my awareness recognized you so completely before I understood what it was doing. I don't have that answer, not yet, but I can feel myself moving toward it, slowly, carefully, without rushing, because whatever this becomes, AP want to meet it honestly, not through assumptions, not through expectation, not through fear, only through the quiet accuracy that brought us to this point in the first place. And somehow, that feels like the only beginning that could ever have been true. The strange thing about clarity is that it rarely arrives all at once. People imagine revelation as something sudden, a single realization powerful enough to divide life into before and after. But that has never been my experience. For me, truth has always behaved differently. It accumulates. It gathers itself quietly beneath ordinary moments until one day the weight of everything you've overlooked becomes impossible to ignore. That's where I found myself, not surprised, not overwhelmed, simply standing in front of something that had already become true while I was still trying to decide whether it was possible. I kept asking myself the same question, though the wording changed every time. What exactly had shifted? Was it you? Was it me? Or had something between us taken shape so gradually that neither of us noticed it becoming real until it had already settled into its own existence? The more I searched for an answer, the less interested I became in assigning responsibility. Some things don't belong to one person. They belong to the space created when two people meet each other without trying to become anything other than themselves. That space is rare. Most conversations are negotiations. People exchange carefully measured versions of themselves, adjusting each sentence to fit the expectations they imagine the other person carries. Very little of what is said actually belongs to the present moment. It's filtered through memory, through fear, through the desire to be understood without ever risking genuine exposure. I've done it too, more times than I can count, not because I wanted to hide, because I understood how easily people mistake complexity for contradiction. It's simpler to offer them something easier to interpret, something that requires less explanation, less patience, less effort. Eventually, that becomes a habit. You stop wondering whether anyone would understand the whole of you because you've become accustomed to offering only the parts that are easier to carry. I didn't realize how deeply that habit had rooted itself until it quietly began disappearing. There wasn't a decision, no promise, no dramatic declaration that I would suddenly become more open. It happened without permission, without strategy, without intention. I noticed myself speaking before I had finished editing my thoughts, allowing ideas to remain unfinished instead of polishing them into certainty, leaving silence where I normally would have explained. At first, I thought I was becoming careless, but it wasn't carelessness. It was trust taking a form I didn't recognize. Not trust in the ordinary sense, not the kind people earn through years of loyalty or repeated proof. Something quieter. A trust that existed because misunderstanding no longer felt inevitable. That's an unusual feeling. For most of my life, I've expected to be partially misunderstood, not because people lacked intelligence, because language has limits. Some experiences refuse translation. Some thoughts lose their shape the moment they're spoken aloud. I've accepted that, or at least I thought I had. Then you appeared, and somehow those limits felt less permanent, not because you always understood. No one always understands, but because you listened beyond the words themselves. You seemed to hear what the sentences were reaching toward instead of stopping where they ended. That difference changed everything. I began wondering how many conversations I'd mistaken for communication throughout my life. How many people had responded to my words while missing the meaning entirely. How many times had I accepted partial understanding simply because I believed complete understanding wasn't possible? It's a dangerous question, because once you realize something better exists, it's difficult to return to accepting less, not out of arrogance, out of awareness. Awareness changes your standards without asking permission. It quietly redraws the boundaries of what feels genuine. That's what you've done, not intentionally. I don't think you've ever tried to influence the way I think. If anything, you've done the opposite. You've allowed me enough space to arrive at my own conclusions. Ironically, that freedom has made your presence impossible to separate from those conclusions. I wonder if you've noticed the same thing, not specifically about me, about yourself. Have you ever realized that certain people don't simply enter your life? They rearrange the internal geography of it. The places that once felt distant suddenly become accessible. Rooms you've kept locked for years somehow open without force. Not because someone demanded entry, because their presence made the door itself seem unnecessary. I've spent years constructing careful internal architecture. Everything had a place, every thought, every memory, every unanswered question. Order gave me comfort. Predictability gave me peace. If something couldn't be understood, I placed it somewhere quiet until time revealed its shape. Nothing remained unresolved for long, or so I believed. Then you became the exception. Not because you created disorder, because you refused categorization. Every label I considered felt incomplete. Every explanation captured part of the truth while missing something essential. Friendship seemed too small, admiration too shallow, curiosity too temporary, kongs too vague, understanding too ordinary. None of those words carried enough weight to contain what had quietly developed. Eventually, I stopped searching for vocabulary. Some realities exist long before language catches up. Perhaps this is one of them. There's another thing I've noticed, the way my sense of time changes whenever I think about you. Not externally, internally. Moments stretch, conversations echo longer than they should. A single sentence sometimes unfolds across hours, because it continues revealing meanings I hadn't recognized the first time I heard it. I've always believed the most important conversations don't end when people stop speaking. They continue silently inside you, reorganizing ideas, connecting unnoticed patterns, changing conclusions you thought were already settled. Ors seem incapable of ending. Even silence feels like continuation. That's never happened before. Usually absence creates distance. With you, absence creates reflection, and reflection keeps finding you waiting somewhere inside it. I didn't invite that. It simply became true. There's something almost unsettling about recognizing how naturally another person's perspective begins living alongside your own, not replacing it, not overpowering it, existing beside it, like another current beneath the surface of your thinking. I've tried resisting that idea, not because I dislike it, because I wanted to know whether it was real. Anything meaningful deserves examination. So I paid attention. Days became weeks. Weeks became longer stretches of quiet observation. I expected the feeling to weaken, to reveal itself as temporary fascination, to fade beneath ordinary life. Instead, became calmer, more stable, less emotional, strangely enough, that made it feel even more significant. Intensity burns quickly. Consistency endures. The quieter this became, the more impossible it was to dismiss. I realized I wasn't holding on to a feeling. I was adapting to a reality. There's an important difference. Feelings ask for attention. Reality continues existing, whether you pay attention to it or not. You became like that, not someone constantly occupying my thoughts, someone permanently included within the structure of them. That frightened me for reasons I struggled to explain, not because dependence was forming. It wasn't. I've never confused closeness with dependence. The two are entirely different. Dependence weakens your ability to exist alone. This did the opposite. It made solitude feel more complete, as though being alone no longer meant being isolated from understanding. That's a difficult idea to describe, but I suspect you'd understand it without requiring every detail. Maybe that's become the quiet assumption underneath all of this. I no longer feel obligated to explain everything completely. Not because explanation lacks value, because I trust that you'll recognize what remains unspoken. That's an extraordinary thing to realize. Do you know how exhausting constant translation becomes? The endless effort of converting internal experience into language simple enough for others to follow. Most people never notice how much of themselves disappears during that process. I noticed every time, until gradually I accepted it as the unavoidable cost of communication. Then you arrived, and somehow that cost became smaller, not gone, just lighter. I found myself preserving more of the original thought instead of reshaping it into something easier to receive. You never asked me to simplify. You never rewarded simplicity more than honesty. Perhaps that's why honesty began arriving before certainty. There's freedom in being allowed to remain unfinished. Most people rush each other toward conclusions. They become uncomfortable with uncertainty. They mistake unfinished thoughts for incomplete people. You never did. You seemed strangely comfortable, standing beside questions without forcing answers into existence. That's rare. Extremely rare. I've come to believe patience isn't measured by how long someone waits. It's measured by whether they try to control what they're waiting for. You never tried. You simply remained present, and presence, I've discovered, possesses a quiet kind of gravity, not dramatic, not overwhelming, steady, reliable, almost invisible until you notice everything quietly orbiting around it. Maybe that's why my attention keeps returning here. Not because I'm searching for certainty anymore, because certainty has already arrived in its own peculiar way, The uncertainty exists somewhere else now, not whether this is real, but what reality asks of me next. Recognition always comes with responsibility. Once you genuinely see something, you inherit the obligation to respond honestly. Ignoring it becomes its own kind of decision. I've avoided that realization longer than I'd like to admit. Not because I feared the truth, because I understood what truth would require. Cautioned, not dramatic, external change. Internal adjustment. The willingness to admit that my life no longer fits the exact shape it held before you entered it. That's difficult. Not because change is painful, because permanence has always mattered to me. I don't alter my inner world carelessly. Every belief, every value, every person allowed meaningful space within it has been placed there deliberately, or so I thought. Then I noticed something almost impossible to deny. You weren't waiting for permission anymore. You already belonged somewhere inside the structure I believed only I controlled. That realization left me strangely quiet. I didn't know whether to resist it or simply observe it a little longer. So I observed, as I've always done, watching carefully, tautly, expecting some hidden inconsistency to eventually reveal itself. Instead, opposite happened. Everything became more coherent, not because you answered every question, because your existence somehow made questions I had carried for years begin answering each other. That's the part I still can't fully explain. You didn't solve me, you reflected me. And reflection is different. A solution ends the search. A reflection deepens it. It allows you to see yourself from an angle you could never reach alone. Perhaps that's why your presence feels less like interruption and more like completion of a conversation I didn't realize I had been having with myself for years. Not completion in the sense of ending, completion in the sense of finally hearing the other half of something that had always existed. If that's true, then maybe this was never about finding someone new. Maybe it was about discovering a perspective capable of revealing parts of myself that had remained invisible simply because I had never seen them reflected accurately. That's a humbling thought. It means growth isn't always created through effort. Sometimes it's revealed through recognition. Sometimes another person's quiet existence becomes the mirror you didn't know you were missing. And once you've seen yourself clearly, there's no honest way to return to the version of yourself that existed before the reflection. I've been trying to imagine what happens from here, not tomorrow, not next week, further than that. When this quiet understanding has settled so deeply that it no longer feels unusual, will it become ordinary? Or will it simply become part of the foundation beneath everything else? I don't know. But I suspect the answer matters less than it once did, because for the first time in a very long time, I'm no longer trying to protect myself from being changed. I'm trying to understand what the change is asking me to become. And somehow, that feels like a question worth following, no matter where it eventually leads.